The year was 1812, and the world beyond the cobbled streets of London was churning in chaos. War loomed on both sides of the Atlantic. Napoleon's ambitions ravaged Europe while Britain's redcoats faced rebellion in distant colonies. In the background of this global drama was a quieter, more curious kind of warfare, one waged not with cannon or musket, but with ink, parchment, and sealed wax. The British Royal Mail was under attack, not by soldiers but by fraud. This is the story of how a mix-up on a rainy autumn evening in 1812 unraveled one of the earliest and most peculiar mail fraud rings in British history, a case that quietly disrupted the very foundation of trust in the Crown's postal service. A rain-soaked departure. On the evening of October 4th, 1812, the Exeter mail coach rolled out from its stable behind the Swan with two necks in London. The coachman, Thomas Rudge, a man with too many years and not enough teeth, flicked the reins lazily as his horses pushed forward through a torrential downpour. Inside the locked, iron-plated compartment were two stout leather bags containing government dispatches, merchant contracts, and private letters. Mail coaches were the arteries of empire. Their arrivals were timed to the minute, and their drivers were often ex-military men known for discipline and discretion. But what departed London that evening was not what it seemed. Unknown to Rudge and the assistant guard sleeping atop the carriage, a swap had already occurred. A switch at the depot. According to testimonies from later inquiries, two men had gained temporary employment as stable hands just days prior to the coach's departure. They'd used forged references and modest charm to infiltrate the chaotic back alleys of the London postal yard. Their names were later identified as Edgar Pilling and Oswald Brent, both veterans of minor cons and former apprentices of the infamous conman Thomas "Black Jack" Hartwell. Their method was simple, almost laughably so. On the eve of the mail's dispatch, they swapped the official pouches with exact replicas complete with forged wax seals and nearly indistinguishable handwriting on the external tags. These forgeries contained worthless scraps of parchment, old newspaper clippings, and several deliberate red herrings, fake love letters, a receipt from a fake brothel, and most notably, a mock military order referencing phantom troops. None of this would be discovered until days later. Discovery at Dorchester. It was not until the coach arrived at Dorchester, a scheduled checkpoint en route to Exeter, that the swap was first suspected. The local postal clerk, Eliza Harcourt, a sharp-minded woman often derided for her peculiar interest in forensic handwriting, was the first to notice something was off. The seal on one of the pouches had a minute irregularity. The lion of the royal arms had only 3 claws. She raised her concerns to the supervising officer, who laughed them off. But Eliza made a copy of the forged seal impression, preserved the pouch's label in a damp towel, and wrote a detailed report before forwarding the bags as instructed. Her instincts would later prove instrumental. The contents revealed. 2 days later in Exeter, the fraud was undeniable. Upon breaking open the pouches in the official sorting house, inspectors found that the military dispatches and financial contracts expected within were either missing or completely falsified. An official inquiry was launched within hours, and an order was sent back along the mail route: arrest everyone who had handled the bags. Thomas Rudge was found drunk in a tavern near Salisbury and taken into custody. The guard who had accompanied him had gone missing entirely. Meanwhile, a separate and more unsettling discovery emerged. 2 identical pouches had turned up in an unrelated shipment to Portsmouth containing portions of the actual documents missing from the Exeter coach. They had been mailed under civilian names, each listed as originating from a Mr. J. Tilbury, a name that would soon haunt investigators across multiple counties. A pattern emerges. Within weeks, investigators from the Royal Mail and Bow Street runners, the precursors to modern police, had begun connecting the dots. There had been a spate of similar incidents in the months prior: mailbags arriving tampered, contracts altered, treasury funds redirected. But until now, there had been no pattern. With the discovery of Mr. Tilbury and the use of male coaches themselves to smuggle forgeries, authorities realized they were dealing not with petty thieves, but with an organized ring capable of infiltrating the very system designed to protect public and royal correspondence. Who was Mr. Tilbury? The name J. Tilbury had never appeared on any official ledger prior to the incidents in September. No such man had been employed by the post office, nor was he known to any of the merchants or military contractors affected by the false dispatches. Yet, receipts and drop addresses under this name appeared in 5 different cities: Portsmouth, Bristol, York, Leeds, and Bath. Investigators began to suspect that Tilbury wasn't a person at all, but a persona, a constructed identity used by the fraud ring to coordinate mail redirection and laundering. The mail system itself had become their weapon. One theory emerged: the forgeries were being used not just for fraud, but to trigger military confusion. If so, was this merely criminal or treasonous? The broader impact. While the financial damage remained modest compared to grander scandals, the psychological damage was immense. Merchants delayed deals, citing fear of fake contracts. Military units hesitated in acting on orders. Letters between lovers were scrutinized. For the first time, the sanctity of the Royal Mail was in question. This crime, as strange and subtle as it was, had weaponized trust. The Ghost Guard. But perhaps the strangest detail of all was the missing assistant guard. His name, according to the schedule logs, was Walter Hewson, aged 27, a recent hire with no criminal record and a spotless reference from a posting in Hereford. Except Hereford officials had no record of such a man, and the signature on his employment file had been forged. Hewson had vanished after the coach reached Dorchester. Some believed he'd been murdered, others that he'd never existed at all. Was Walter Hewson merely another alias? Could he have been Tilbury himself? The open question. By the year's end, the Royal Mail had instituted stricter hearing protocols, multi-stage seal authentication, and randomized routing procedures. But the full truth of the Great Mail coach mix-up remained elusive. Was this a criminal scheme, an act of espionage, or simply a con gone brilliantly out of control? And more hauntingly, if the forgeries were discovered, were there others still undetected? A system under siege. By late October of 1812, London's General Post Office was in crisis. The Postmaster General, Sir Francis Freeling, faced pressure from Parliament and the War Office to explain not only the fraud uncovered in Exeter, but how such a breach could occur without detection, until well after critical documents had been falsified, delayed, or worse, redirected to unknown actors. Sir Francis, a fastidious and forward-thinking man, had already begun to modernize the postal system. But this case exposed cracks in the very foundation of those efforts. The fact that someone had managed to replicate secure mail bags, forge seals, and vanish into thin air within the framework of the Royal Mail was nothing short of humiliating. A special task force was established in November, a blend of postal inspectors, Bow Street runners, and, curiously, a civilian consultant, Miss Eliza Harcourt, the Dorchester clerk whose handwriting expertise had first raised the alarm. Her inclusion was controversial, but Freeling was desperate. And as it would turn out, Eliza Harcourt would become one of the unsung pioneers of what we now call forensic document examination. The Tilbury Files. The first goal of the task force was simple: identify every documented instance in the previous 18 months where a letter or parcel had been received from or directed to Mr. J. Tilbury. Using ledger records from postmasters across southern and central England, Eliza spent weeks comparing entries. The results were staggering. At least 27 known mailings could be linked to the Tilbury alias, spanning from Edinburgh to Plymouth. The destinations were rarely homes or businesses. Most were general delivery pickups addresses where no signature was required, and the recipient could collect mail anonymously, a practice that had existed to accommodate transient workers and merchants. This detail suggested something chilling. The fraud ring had known the system's weaknesses intimately. Whoever Tilbury was or whoever had assumed that identity had leveraged those gaps to their advantage. The first break. It was in the York Ledger, however, that the investigation found its first tangible lead. Among the Tilbury-linked deliveries was a single address associated not with a general delivery point, but with a business, Ashcombe and Brown Shipping Co. The firm was modest, a coastal shipping concern moving textiles and timber between Bristol, Liverpool, and French ports during the brief lulls in wartime embargoes. It had never previously appeared in criminal investigations. But something didn't sit right with Eliza. The receiver's signature for the Tilbury parcel, a hastily scribbled J. Thomas, bore resemblance to handwriting found on one of the forged seals from the Exeter incident. The loop on the J and the slash of the T were nearly identical. She alerted Inspector Caleb Gorin, one of the Bow Street men assigned to the case. Ashcombe and Brown's offices were searched on November 22nd. The shipping connection. Inside the firm's rented rooms in Bristol, investigators uncovered a curious set of documents: partial mail coach schedules, 2 worn postal uniform caps, and a collection of wax seals and brass impressions, some authentic, some clearly homemade. Most damning of all was a half-burned letter recovered from the fireplace. Though only partially legible, the words, "A Tilbury route changed, Dorchester drop compromised," were visible. It was the first written evidence connecting the fraud ring to the Tilbury alias. Further investigation revealed that one of the company's junior clerks, a man by the name of Reginald Crawley, had abruptly left the firm the week after the Exeter incident. He told coworkers he was off to Newcastle for an inheritance and was never seen again. Postmasters in Newcastle, however, reported no such arrival. Crawley's shadow. Crawley's name brought up only a faint criminal history, mostly public drunkenness and gambling debts, but his known associates painted a different picture. He had been seen at the Red Lamp Tavern in London weeks prior to the Exeter fraud, drinking with known con artist Edgar Pilling, one of the 2 forged stable hands involved in the original switch. This confirmed suspicions. The Ashcombe and Brown offices had been used as a front. Crawley had likely been one of the key organizers and may have even posed as Tilbury himself. But was he working alone? A deeper game. At this point, the Royal Mail was no longer the only institution concerned. The War Office, having received news that certain falsified documents may have interfered with troop deployment orders near Dover, initiated its own quiet inquiry. Officials feared that if the fraud ring had sold military secrets or created convincing forgeries, the consequences could be catastrophic. But thus far, no evidence had surfaced to suggest foreign espionage. In fact, many of the military documents found in the fake mailbags appeared deliberately absurd. One referenced an order for 6 camels and a brass compass to be delivered to Wales. Investigators began to suspect that the fraud had a secondary layer: misinformation. Perhaps the fake orders weren't meant to deceive British officials, but to discredit the Royal Mail itself to make it appear unreliable or corrupt. If so, the motive had shifted from simple greed to disruption. The hunt for the guard. Meanwhile, the mystery of Walter Hewson, the missing guard, deepened. Several sightings of a man matching his description were reported in Southampton in early November. A local innkeeper swore the man had paid in coin with a Scottish accent and a twitching left eye, a detail that matched a note in the guard's hearing file. But no other witnesses could confirm it. Some began to speculate that Hewson may have been none other than Reginald Crawley in disguise, or that Hewson had been used, then eliminated. That theory gained traction when a body washed ashore near Portsmouth on December 2nd. It was too decomposed to identify, but the victim wore remnants of what may have been a postal uniform coat. The coroner's report was inconclusive. Eliza's theory. Eliza Harcourt, now regarded as the team's indispensable analyst, offered a theory by year's end. She believed the fraud ring had operated more like a stage production than a traditional criminal outfit. Each man played a part. Some stole, some posed as officials, others created plausible records to support the fictions. The swap on the Exeter coach had been merely the most successful in a string of escalating dress rehearsals. But what disturbed her most was what the group hadn't yet done. "They've shown us the playbill," she wrote in her notes, "but the final act, I fear, has yet to open." The midnight envelope. Just after Christmas, a plain envelope arrived at the Bow Street offices. It bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a charcoal sketch of a mail coach tipped sideways into a ravine. The wheels were shattered. The driver slumped. Beneath the drawing were the words, "You were watching the wrong bag." The postmark, Carlisle, a place far north of any previously recorded Tilbury correspondence. The implication was clear. The group was still active, and they were watching the investigators just as closely as they were being pursued. The lingering uncertainty. With no arrests made and no confirmed deaths, the fraud ring remained at least in part intact. Ashcombe and Brown closed its doors, and Crawley was never recovered. The Royal Mail continued to implement reform. Biometric tracking of mail keys, multiple witnesses for sealings, and hidden identifiers in official wax stamps. But trust was fractured. And even among the investigators, a creeping suspicion took hold. What if the fraud wasn't designed to profit at all? What if it was meant to test the system to map its vulnerabilities for someone else's future use? Who were they working for? And what was still to come? Into the north. By early January 1813, with snow falling steadily across the English countryside, the investigation had turned north. The Carlisle postmark on the mysterious envelope sent to Bow Street wasn't just a taunt, it was a trail. Carlisle, perched on the edge of the borderlands between England and Scotland, had long been a haven for smugglers and debt dodgers. The city's tangle of alleyways, hidden cellars, and underground passages made it a difficult place to police. If the fraud ring had migrated there, it wasn't without reason. A new investigator was added to the case, Captain Elias Brechin, a former Royal Navy intelligence officer now working with the War Office. His specialty, disguised communications and signal interception skills honed against French privateers and inland spies. Brechin's job was to determine whether the fraud was criminal mischief or covert sabotage. His conclusion would change the direction of the investigation forever. The Tallow Street incident. On January 12th, a raid was conducted on a suspected safe house on Tallow Street, a narrow lane off the main market in Carlisle. Brechin, alongside Inspector Caleb Gorin and two Bow Street runners, entered the premises under the guise of being tax assessors. The flat appeared abandoned until they found the attic hatch. Inside the crawlspace were 3 wool sacks packed with mail. Some were legitimate letters likely stolen. Others were partial forgeries, contracts with the ink still drying, doctored merchant agreements, and envelopes postmarked with impossible dates. But most disturbing of all was a hand-drawn map of the Royal Mail route network, annotated with marks like soft check, blind hand, and auto truster. These were not casual terms. They implied detailed knowledge of mail logistics, human behavior, and systemic loopholes. A second envelope, unopened, was labeled only with 2 words. The final pouch. The confession. That same night, another envelope was delivered, this time to the General Post Office in London. It contained a confession, or at least What read like one? Written in an exaggerated, almost theatrical tone, it began. To the keepers of letters and lords of delivery. You hunt ghosts in stable coats and call yourselves men of law. But we are not thieves, we are editors, and England is our manuscript. You ask what we took, no, ask what we rewrote. The letter was unsigned, but a single symbol was drawn at the bottom, a quill snapped in two. It would come to be known in the case files simply as the editor's mark. From this point forward, the investigators realized the truth. They had not been pursuing a con, or even sabotage. They had been chasing a philosophy. The editor theory. The editor's mark was discovered later in two additional places, carved into a beam in the Ashcombe and Brown office cellar, and etched faintly into the underside of a postal carriage seat in Bath. Captain Brecken developed what would be known as the editor theory, that the mail frauds were part of a larger ideological movement, dedicated to disrupting systems of authority through misinformation. These individuals weren't seeking profit in the traditional sense. They were manufacturing alternate realities through documents, false orders, fake contracts, misleading correspondences. Their purpose was to undermine the very concept of objective truth delivered through official channels. This was more than crime, it was narrative warfare. The final pouch revealed. Inside the pouch found in Carlisle, investigators found what at first appeared to be a mix of unrelated documents. A letter of resignation from a fictional Lord Minister of Paper Goods. A forged will naming the British public as sole beneficiary of a non-existent fortune. A death certificate for a man named Walter Hewson, dated November 1st, 1812. The problem, that date was before Hewson had even disappeared. The implication was horrifying. The fraud ring had prepared for the fallout of their scheme before it had occurred. They weren't improvising, they were orchestrating events according to a script. One of the Bow Street runners reportedly whispered, "They're not robbing us, they're writing us." The man with the silver watch. On February 5th, a key figure finally surfaced: Oswald Brent, one of the two original stable hands involved in the mail coach switch. He was spotted in Manchester by a coal merchant who recognized him from a wanted sketch posted weeks earlier. Brent was arrested while trying to board a coal barge headed for the River Humber. He carried no identification, but in his pocket was a silver watch engraved with the initials TH. Inside the lid was a tiny, intricate carving of the editor's mark. Under questioning, Brent said very little. When asked directly if he was Tilbury, he smiled and said, "Tilbury is a character, we just play the parts." Brent was held at Newgate Prison for 3 months and eventually convicted of impersonation, mail fraud, and conspiracy. But he never named his associates. In fact, he claimed, "There is no ring, only readers and writers." He died in prison in 1815. Legacy and reform. The Great Mail Coach mix-up triggered a wave of reforms. Double authentication seals were implemented, requiring regional postmasters to log unique, private impressions. Driver and guard rotations were randomized weekly. Known aliases like Tilbury were blacklisted in mail registration systems. And a newly established role, the forensic reader, was introduced to screen for forged handwriting and pattern anomalies. Miss Eliza Harcourt became the first civilian to hold this title officially, and her methods became the groundwork for early forensic document analysis in the United Kingdom. The letters that followed. Over the next 2 years, 6 more letters bearing the editor's mark were received by postmasters across England. Each came with no return address and no threat, only commentary. In one, a short note read, "You read what we wanted. But what did we write?" No more frauds were discovered of the same scale, but the fear lingered. Inspectors began looking at letters differently, wondering not only if they were forged, but why they existed at all. Was it really just about crime? Or had the Royal Mail been the unwitting stage for something far more performative, a shadow theater of falsehood, satire, and quiet rebellion? A last reflection. 2 centuries have passed since the mailbags were swapped. The names Brent, Pilling, Crawley, Hewson, Tilbury have faded into the dusty corners of archival footnotes. But in the Museum of the Modern British Postal System, one item remains on display. A single pouch sealed in wax, untouched. The tag reads simply, "Final delivery pending." No one knows what's inside. No one has dared open it. Because sometimes, in the world of true crime, the most dangerous thing isn't what you steal. It's what you leave behind. A town built on trust. Tucked in the gentle hills of rural Nottinghamshire was the village of Elm Grove, so quiet that it often escaped the notice of even its own county officials. In the 1870s, it was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, letters were left in milk tins, and the only excitement came when a new cart passed through the market square. Elm Grove thrived not because of industry or innovation, but because of something harder to quantify: trust. The villagers shared tools, news, and family tragedies like sacred currency. And at the heart of that social economy was the Elm Grove Parish Credit Union, a small financial institution run out of a converted parsonage. It had only 3 employees, but only one name mattered: Mrs. Adelaide Collingwood, the head clerk and de facto manager. A widow in her early 50s, Adelaide was known for her lace collars, handwritten Bible verses, and a firm belief that numbers tell the truth. She was seen as an anchor for the community, a quiet custodian of people's life savings and futures. So when, in the autumn of 1876, the credit union suddenly collapsed, leaving dozens of villagers bankrupt, no one could have imagined that the source of the crime wasn't a masked thief or outsider. It was Adelaide herself. The first whispers. It began with small oddities: a discrepancy in a widow's savings account, a missing signature on a promissory note. One farmer, James Hocking, claimed he'd made a payment on his loan in August, yet the record showed none. Mrs. Collingwood blamed the new apprentice and made good on the mistake by adjusting the books herself. But then the Henshaws, an elderly couple who had banked with the union for over a decade, came forward with a far larger issue. Their nest egg, some 87 pounds, had vanished. Adelaide was calm as always. She assured them it was a filing error. She would correct it by next Thursday. But when Thursday came, she didn't appear at the union office, nor the next day. By Saturday, she was gone. The office is sealed. The constable, one Robert Kersey, broke into the credit union office with a local magistrate present. Inside, the desk drawer locked with a brass key later found in Adelaide's sewing kit, they found 2 ledgers. One was neat, proper, and publicly known. It tracked deposits, loans, and interest with fastidious detail. The second was a darker twin. Marked only with the initials AC, it contained a coded record of off-the-books loans, manipulated interest rates, and withdrawals not tied to any names, only aliases. Milkman, Bacchus Boy, Widow M. One entry, scrawled in unusually rushed handwriting, read: Elm Trust is too blind to see. All debts paid in full. Only the ledger owes me now. It was clear. Adelaide hadn't just made a clerical error. She had been running a shadow bank inside the union for years. How it worked? With the help of an accountant from Nottingham, investigators unraveled the scheme over the following weeks. Adelaide had exploited the union's paper-based accounting system, which had no external audits and relied entirely on trust. She would record deposits correctly in the main ledger, but duplicate them in the secret ledger, often assigning funds to non-existent loans she issued under aliases. use those alias accounts to move real funds between accounts, siphoning off the difference while maintaining a superficial balance on paper. Offer favorable rates to villagers who brought in new deposits, thus building confidence while deepening her control. This technique, now recognized as a primitive form of a ledger double shuffle, allowed her to maintain appearances for nearly 8 years. By the time the fraud was uncovered, the union had a shortfall of over £1,200, a devastating sum in a village where the average yearly income was under £30. Motive or madness? The question that haunted Elm Grove wasn't just how Adelaide had done it, but why. Her modest cottage held no signs of wealth. Her wardrobe was simple. She didn't travel. She donated regularly to the local orphanage. If she had been stealing, she had not been living lavishly. What investigators did find, however, were 27 letters unsent drafts, tucked into a biscuit tin beneath a loose floorboard. Each letter was written to Nathaniel Collingwood, her deceased husband, a stonemason who had died in a quarry collapse in 1865. The letters grew more erratic over time. In early entries, she spoke of loneliness, debt, and her struggle to be taken seriously by the parish men. In later drafts, she began referring to the credit union as hers, claiming, "This town will only notice the weight of my hands when their money becomes my silence." Whether these were the writings of a woman descending into delusion or calculated expressions of frustration remained unclear. But one thing was certain: her disappearance had not been a panicked flight, it had been planned. The railway sighting. In November of 1876, nearly 6 weeks after she vanished, a ticket clerk at the Doncaster rail station came forward. He remembered an older woman with graying hair and a worn carpet bag purchasing a ticket to Scarborough. She paid in coin, mostly shillings, and wore gloves despite the mild weather. Her name in the passenger log, Mrs. E. Hargrave. The name was familiar. In fact, it appeared in Adelaide's secret ledger. Under Hargrave, there were 3 entries. 1871, withdrawal for repairs. 1873, loan note forgiven. 1875, end account Hargrave now me. Investigators concluded that Hargrave was one of her favored aliases. She had used it to create the illusion of a customer while actually funneling funds for her own use. Scarborough was searched, but no trace of her was found. Some locals claimed to have seen a woman matching her description working as a schoolmistress under another name, but the trail went cold by Christmas. The impact on Elm Grove. The collapse of the credit union devastated the village. 12 families lost their entire life savings. 3 local businesses were forced to close. One farmer, unable to secure a loan for winter feed, lost his entire cattle stock and left for Liverpool by spring. The parish council, ashamed, refused to speak publicly about the incident for years. They sealed the second ledger and placed it in the village church archives, where it remained, mostly untouched, until its rediscovery in 2003 by a historical researcher. The archivist who catalogued it, Dr. Eleanor Wills, described the book as a quiet scream pressed between paper and ink. Lingering questions. Though the fraud was exposed, no trial ever occurred. Adelaide Collingwood was never found. Rumors ranged from her fleeing to the colonies to entering a convent under a new name. One popular theory among locals held that she had never left Elm Grove at all, that she lived out her days in an abandoned stone cottage near the old quarry, emerging only at night to gather supplies. A handful of children even claimed to have seen the ghost widow with the ledger eyes in the woods. No evidence ever supported these tales. But in 1892, a skeleton was found in a dried-out well behind the abandoned quarry buildings. Wrapped in linen, with a silver locket containing a lock of dark hair and a folded paper reading, "All debts paid." The body was never formally identified. The final entry. At the very end of Adelaide's secret ledger, beneath the aliases, the false balances, and the swirling handwriting, was one last entry, written in delicate, fatting ink. It was never about money. It was about being seen. No one knows whether she regretted what she'd done. But one thing is certain. She was finally noticed. A village under suspicion. By January 1877, 3 months after the collapse of the Elm Grove Parish Credit Union, the shock had turned to something colder: suspicion. With no arrest and no confession, the villagers of Elm Grove began to turn inward. Whispered theories filled the marketplace and pews. The grocery boy who'd once delivered to Adelaide's home was accused of being a courier for her schemes. A retired vicar was rumored to have known about the second ledger and stayed silent. Even Constable Kersey, who had cracked open the office door, was not immune. Some claimed he had waited too long before notifying Nottingham authorities. Grief had curdled into distrust. The credit union's former clients, many of them elderly or widowed, took to burying what remained of their savings under floorboards or inside coal bins. The very notion of banking had become tainted. In Elm Grove, the phrase "check the ledger" became less a call to account and more a subtle accusation. But while the village sank into paranoia, one man was just beginning to peel back the deeper layers of Adelaide's deception. His name was Edwin Malton, and he wasn't a policeman or a banker. He was a language tutor. The Malton manuscript. Malton, a mild-mannered Latin instructor from Derby, had known Adelaide years before briefly as a client. He had taught her nephew, and remembered her as a woman who understood rhythm in language better than most poets. When he heard of the credit union collapse and the talk of a second ledger, he traveled to Elm Grove on his own accord. At first, he was dismissed by the investigating officers. But when Malton offered to translate the cryptic entries found in the ledger, many written in code, abbreviation, or obscure short form, Constable Kersey reluctantly allowed him access to a facsimile. What Malton discovered shifted the case from simple financial fraud to something more intricate and more intimate. A secret vocabulary. Adelaide's second ledger wasn't just a shadow record of finances. It was, in parts, a coded diary. The entries were written in a strange blend of short-form Latin, banking symbols, and an idiosyncratic cipher involving flower names, references to hymn numbers, and even birdsong codes where specific birds correlated to people or events. Some examples. Wren's nest filled again. No interest charged. Possibly a reference to a friend or dependent receiving funds without expectation of repayment. Buttercup blooms in drought. Right arrow, a signal that someone had deposited money unexpectedly. Hymn 144 reversed. Right arrow in the 1849 hymnal. Hymn 144 was about divine justice. Reversed, it may have meant she believed justice had failed. Malton cataloged nearly 200 phrases and created what became known in later historical circles as the Collingwood Glossary, a key to interpreting the psychological and emotional logic behind the fraud. Adelaide wasn't just recording numbers. She was documenting a moral system, one that differed from the village's laws, but one she clearly followed. Not a thief. According to Malton's analysis, many of the loans Adelaide had issued from the secret ledger were directed at individuals in dire circumstances: unwed mothers, failed crops, and widows who had fallen behind on taxes. Some of these clients had no idea they received illicit funds. They believed Adelaide had simply granted them extensions or found extra money in church funds. In effect, she had been running a private, moralistic redistribution scheme. One entry read, "Mrs. E's child fed, milkman's son fixed the door, neither shall owe another." It seemed Adelaide wasn't hoarding wealth. She was redistributing it on her own terms, in secret, outside the patriarchal and bureaucratic systems that had long ignored such people. The fraud remained a crime, but Adelaide's motive was no longer greed, it was control. She had rewritten the social contract of Elm Grove using financial fiction. The name that didn't fit. Among the coded names in the second ledger, one stood out to Malton, the Hollow Man. This alias appeared 14 times, each time next to a transaction involving larger sums, and each marked with a note in red ink. Unlike the other entries, there was no flowery metaphor, no hymnal reference. Instead, Hollow Man returned again, demanded full take, refused Hollow's interest, was reminded of April 13. And this, can't pretend he's part of the garden. These phrases suggested that Adelaide had been working under pressure or coercion. The Hollow Man, Malton believed, may have been blackmailing her. Or worse, may have been part of the scheme from the beginning. April 13 was circled repeatedly throughout the ledger, but what had happened that day? An unreported robbery. In a twist of bureaucratic luck, Malton came across an old notice in a Nottinghamshire tax record archive. On April 13, 1872, the credit union had reported a break-in, a window shattered, a desk drawer forced open. Nothing was said to be stolen, and no formal complaint was filed with police. That break-in had been quietly resolved, no doubt at Adelaide's instruction. But what if that incident had been the moment someone, the Hollow Man, discovered the second ledger? What if Adelaide had been compromised for years? This theory changed everything. She may have been a fraudster and a victim. The Widow's Trap. Further exploration into Adelaide's home revealed more than just unsent letters. Hidden behind the stone fireplace was a compartment containing a third ledger, not financial, but personal. It included handwritten copies of village gossip, charity records, and even observations about community members' behavior. It was surveillance. She had cataloged the village like a scientist observing birds. Reverend Maltby lies about sermons, drinks behind his shed. Ethel G. cheats on the sugar weight, twice confirmed. Hollow enters at dusk, leaves with none watching, always wears the red gloves. The last note offered a chilling detail: red gloves. This was the first concrete description of the Hollow Man. Suddenly, the question shifted from where did Adelaide go, to did she go willingly? A cloaked departure. Malton interviewed 3 former apprentices of the credit union. One, a shy boy named Simon Fratch, recalled something strange. The night before she left, I saw her at the churchyard. She was talking to a tall man, black coat, gloves, and a hat so wide it covered his face. I thought it was a priest, but I heard her say, "I gave you more than you asked." And he said, "You bought time, not freedom." Simon hadn't told anyone, afraid he'd be accused of eavesdropping or lying. This encounter, if true, suggested Adelaide's disappearance wasn't an escape. It may have been a forced departure. The Hollow Man wasn't just part of her crime, he was its shadow. Was she being extorted, or was she covering for someone else's threat? The Red Glove Man. Over the next 6 months, sightings of a man matching the red glove description were reported across the Midlands. In Matlock, he inquired about opening a quiet investment firm. In Buxton, he purchased a large amount of parchment and ink under the name Mr. Eddington. In Leek, he left behind a notebook in a rooming house blank, except for one line on the inside cover. The widow wrote the story, but I own the ending. The notebook disappeared before it could be recovered. A fatting trail. Despite months of searching, no trace of Adelaide Collingwood was ever found. But the idea of her, what she represented, grew stronger over time. To some, she became a local cautionary tale, the woman who stole from friends and vanished in shame. To others, she was a kind of folk heroine, a woman who dared to redistribute wealth when the systems around her failed. and to a few, especially those who believed in the hollow man, she was a woman who paid a price she never fully explained. The question she left behind: was Adelaide the author of her fraud? Or was she merely a character in someone else's design? A village rewrites its history. By the spring of 1877, Elm Grove had begun the slow, bitter work of recovery. The parish credit union remained closed. A temporary loan scheme was established by a sympathetic merchants' guild from Nottingham, offering modest support to families in crisis, but it was not enough. The village shopkeeper began accepting barter again. Children left school early to help on farms, and marriages were postponed due to ruined dowries. Yet amid the visible hardship, there was something else, a quiet rewriting of Adelaide Collingwood's memory. The townspeople, perhaps unwilling to live with the weight of betrayal, began to reframe her disappearance in folklore. She only took from those who had plenty, some would say. She gave more than she stole. God must have taken her before the law could. It wasn't true, not completely, but in places where justice never came, memory often smooths over the edges of fact. Still, not everyone in Elm Grove was ready to let go. Malton's final discovery. In June 1877, Edwin Malton returned to Elm Grove for what he intended to be the last time. But before leaving, he was granted access to the full original second ledger, no longer a facsimile, but the fragile, ink-blotted book itself. Within its brittle pages, he found something everyone else had missed. On the inside cover, beneath the pasted label and ornamental border, was a thin layer of tracing paper. When carefully lifted, it revealed a faint imprint, not in ink, but in pressure. It was a signature. A. Collingwood, but beneath it, another name had been written and erased. E. Hargrave. More telling was what came next, scrawled faintly, sideways, and in barely legible script. Not for their forgiveness, but for their understanding. It was the closest thing to a confession she had ever left behind. The Hollow Man returns. In the autumn of that same year, the Hollow Man returned, if only in shadow. A fire broke out at the old quarry house outside Elm Grove, a property long abandoned and thought haunted by children. Among the ashes, the constable discovered charred fragments of paper and a twisted piece of metal believed to be a signet ring. The papers were partially legible. Most were lists of names and amounts, not matching anything in the known ledgers. One page, however, contained a single phrase written repeatedly. She should have stayed in the margins. The style of writing matched several notes attributed to the Hollow Man. Forensic analysis did not exist in any meaningful sense in 1877, but Malton, called again to assist, was certain. The handwriting was not Adelaide. It seemed someone else had returned to Elm Grove not to right wrongs, but perhaps to erase them. Unclaimed wealth. Later that year, a small lockbox was discovered buried behind the old church undercroft, unlocked by a key hidden behind one of the hymnals. Inside were £47 in mixed coin, wrapped in a velvet cloth, a ring engraved with the initials N.C., presumed to have belonged to Nathaniel Collingwood, and a third item, a letter folded carefully, addressed not to a person but to a place. To the dust of Elm Grove. The letter read, "You asked for justice but gave no mercy. I asked for help and was given judgment. I returned what I owed, not for the law, for the boy with no shoes, the girl with no milk, the widow with no voice. I do not ask for forgiveness, only that you remember the ledger was not the crime." The silence was. It was unsigned, but there was no doubt the words were Adelaide. Echoes in modern records. In 2003, historian Dr. Eleanor Wills, working on a study of rural banking collapses, uncovered the sealed parish records and brought the story to light in a small monograph titled The Widow's Ledger. an accounting of shadows. She tracked down records of Adelaide's early life, including letters sent between her and her husband while he was working at a quarry in Derbyshire. They were filled with affection, wit, and the seed of something deeper, a frustration at the limits placed on her because of her gender and marital status. Nathaniel had written in one letter, "You are sharper than any man in this town, Addie. It's not the numbers that frighten them, it's your mind." Dr. Wills proposed a new theory, that Adelaide had not acted alone in her fraud, but rather had been the public face of a deeper struggle, a localized resistance to the economic rigidity that left widows, orphans, and poor laborers without options. A kind of moral insurgency, hidden in account books. The ethics of embezzlement. Modern scholars have debated whether Adelaide's actions should be viewed through the lens of criminal justice, moral philosophy, or early feminist rebellion. Was she a thief who manipulated trust and shattered lives? Or a reluctant outlaw, pushed by desperation into the role of redistributor? Was the hollow man a metaphor for the faceless forces of authority, or a real coercive presence in her life? The debate remains unresolved. But what's known is this: Adelaide Collingwood didn't vanish in disgrace. She vanished into myth. A memorial without a name. In 2015, on the 150th anniversary of the credit union's founding, Elm Grove's town council installed a brass plaque near the church wall. It does not name her. It simply reads, "In memory of those who were lost, and those who were never found." Beneath it, people still leave small tokens, coins, feathers, handwritten notes on scraps of linen. Final reflection. In the end, Adelaide's crime was not in stealing pounds and pence. Her greatest transgression was believing she could rewrite the rules in plain ink, and that no one would notice. Or perhaps she knew we would. And perhaps that was the point. A man without echo. Chicago, 1923. The city was growing faster than its bones could stretch. Skyscrapers pierced through the smoke-thick air. Automobiles crowded muddy lanes. Gang wars brewed in alley shadows, and prohibition turned liquor into gold. But for all its noise, one place in the city remained utterly quiet. The Cook County Coroner's Office. Located in a cold brick building on the edge of Harrison Street, just far enough from the rattle of the elevated train, the coroner's office was a monument to bureaucracy, efficient, silent, and emotionally sterile. At its center was a man named Dr. Emery Black, the longest-serving county coroner the city had ever known. He rarely spoke, he rarely smiled, and for nearly 30 years he signed every death certificate with a black steel-nib pen and an unwavering hand. Most in the city didn't know his name. But Emery Black held more secrets about death than any gangster or gravedigger alive. And in the summer of 1923, someone finally asked a question that would unravel the quiet empire he had built, one forged not from crime scenes or mob shootouts, but from paper. The first discrepancy. It began with a student. Helen Maris, a 26-year-old medical intern at Mercy Hospital, was performing her rotation through the county coroner's office. She had no ambitions beyond general practice, and her time in the morgue was supposed to be brief. But Helen was meticulous, some would say annoyingly so. One afternoon, while reviewing old files for her pathology assignment, she noticed something strange. 2 death certificates from the same week, one for a Peter Liscombe, a 62-year-old tailor, and another for Rachel Stern, a 34-year-old housemaid, had identical phrasing in the cause of death section. Pulmonary failure following acute collapse of circulatory pressure. The handwriting was the same. The line spacing was the same. Even the small ink dot on the I in circulatory was in the exact same place. Helen compared more certificates. She found 12 more, all issued within a 6-month period, with the same description. Same ink, same hand, Same phrasing. She asked the clerk. He shrugged. Dr. Black writes all of them. That's his way. Patterns in paper. Helen returned to Mercy Hospital and mentioned it to her attending, Dr. Samuel Varnum, a veteran physician and former military medic. He laughed off the initial concern until she showed him the certificates. Varnum's tone changed immediately. This isn't just habit, he said. This looks like someone printing templates. He made a quiet request to an old friend in city records. Within days, they were looking at over 200 certificates, all signed by Emery Black between 1919 and 1923. Nearly a third used some variation of the exact same phrase. Another third had only slight differences, rotating between 3 or 4 cause of death templates. It was legal. It wasn't even that unusual, given the volume of cases the coroner's office handled. But it was too neat. Too quiet. The outliers. Helen dove deeper and found what would become the most damning detail. Among the certificates using the repeated phrasing, several involved unusual circumstances, unattended deaths in hotels, transient individuals found near railway lines, and 2 immigrants who had reportedly died in custody. In those cases, no external autopsy report existed, just the certificate and Dr. Black's signature. When Helen requested the accompanying files, she was told by the clerk, "That's all there is." A city of over 3 million people, and the dead were being signed away with no further inquiry. The missing ledger. Dr. Emery Black had long been known for refusing interviews. He kept no staff beyond a stenographer and 2 rotating assistants. But according to one retired coroner's aide, in the late 1910s, Black kept a personal ledger, a brown book where he made notes on the cases worth remembering. That ledger, according to the aide, disappeared after the 1919 race riots, when dozens of corpses flooded the coroner's office in a single week. Some said Black burned it after being accused of racial bias in his determinations. Others claimed the ledger had been stolen by a reporter who later died under mysterious circumstances. The truth no one knew. But it had become legend, and Helen Maris began to wonder what had been written in that book. A visit denied. Helen attempted to speak with Dr. Black personally. She visited the office 3 times. Each time she was told, "The doctor isn't seeing visitors." The last time she caught a glimpse of him in the hallway, tall, pale, with shock-white hair and gloves, even indoors. He glanced at her, then turned away. When she left that day, she found a small note tucked under the windshield of her borrowed hospital vehicle. "The dead are quiet, you should be too." It was unsigned. Helen turned the note in to the police. They filed a report. Nothing came of it. The natural causes crisis. Around the same time Helen was raising concerns, the Chicago Tribune had begun investigating a sharp rise in natural cause deaths among immigrant laborers, particularly those in railroad, slaughterhouse, and factory jobs. Their internal review found that from 1920 to 1923, over 600 deaths had been attributed to generic cardiac arrest or pulmonary failure with no autopsy. Many of these individuals had no surviving family. They were buried in unmarked graves in county plots. Almost all were signed by Emery Black. When asked for comment, Black issued a single statement. "If you want poetry, go to a priest. I report what the body shows." The Tribune dropped the story a month later. No official action was taken. The Talmadge case. But then came the tipping point. In late August 1923, a wealthy industrialist named Rupert Talmadge died suddenly in his home in Evanston. He was a quiet figure, known for philanthropy, but also rumored to have ties to labor suppression in the packing plants. Dr. Emery Black declared the death natural causes, citing acute heart failure. But Talmadge's private physician, suspicious of the lack of bruising or seizure signs, ordered a second opinion from a private coroner. That coroner found traces of strychnine, a poison that causes convulsions and can mimic cardiac symptoms in small doses. The press had a field day. Suddenly, Black was no longer invisible. He was front-page news. A system on trial. An emergency panel was formed. Black was called to testify. At 68 years old, he appeared before the county board in full morning suit, with black gloves and a thick portfolio of paperwork. He answered calmly, "I sign what I observe. I do not speculate. If a body lacks sufficient evidence of trauma or interference, I do not invent a cause." The panel presented over a dozen cases where no visible trauma had been found, only chemical signature detected much later by private inquests. Black remained unmoved. "You can dig up every poor soul this city has buried. You'll still find silence, because that's all the poor are given in death." It was the only time he raised his voice. The room was silent. The final ledger. Before the board could make a formal ruling, something unexpected happened. Dr. Emery Black resigned. He submitted a one-sentence letter. "The quiet will continue with or without me." Days later, his assistant, while clearing out his office, found a false wall panel in the back of a file cabinet. Inside was the missing personal ledger. It contained thousands of entries. But it wasn't a record of deaths. It was a log of refusals. Every time Black had been asked by police, ward bosses, factory owners, and even federal agents to adjust a death ruling or ignore suspicious findings, he'd written it down. Each entry was dated, signed, and described the bribe, pressure, or threat he had received. Among them, October 1919, pressure to label riot victim as thief, refused. March 1922, requested to omit factory incident, 5 deaths, no. July 1923, warned to avoid poison findings in Talmadge, declined. The implication: Black hadn't been protecting the system. He had been resisting it in his own rigid, secretive way. By avoiding deeper investigations, he had, in his view, prevented external manipulation. His silence wasn't apathy. It was defiance. Reflection. Dr. Emery Black died a year later in anonymity, living in a boarding house under a false name. Helen Maris went on to become one of the first female forensic pathologists in Illinois. She kept the note he'd left on her windshield, not as a threat but as a reminder. The dead are quiet, you should be too. But Helen never stayed quiet. Because sometimes, the only way to honor the silence of the dead is to speak for them. A City of Secrets. By late 1923, the revelation of Dr. Emery Black's hidden ledger had ignited a quiet storm in Chicago's political and law enforcement communities. The ledger didn't contain details of the dead, but of the living. A record of corrupt officials, bribery attempts, and pressure from industry leaders attempting to rewrite causes of death for their own purposes. It had always been assumed that Dr. Black's refusal to conduct autopsies, or his tendency to write vague death reports, stemmed from laziness or institutional indifference. But now it seemed that his detachment was intentional. He hadn't been covering for power. He had been withholding it from them. And still one question remained. At what cost? The ledger goes public. The decision to release the ledger's contents was controversial. The Cook County Board of Supervisors, embarrassed by its own inaction, attempted to suppress the findings, citing unverified allegations. But Helen Maris, with the backing of the Chicago Tribune and a coalition of medical professionals, fought for its release. In November 1923, select pages were leaked to the press. Headlines read, "Coroner kept list of bribes City Hall named." "Dead Man's Book Royals, Labor Investigations." "Who really killed Chicago's workers?" The public's reaction was swift and sharp. but legal action slow at best. The names in the ledger, many still holding office, denied involvement, claimed forgery, or fell silent. Investigations were launched, only to dissolve weeks later due to lack of cooperating witnesses. The dead, after all, do not testify. Helen's quiet crusade. Rather than chase headlines, Helen Maris began a painstaking review of Dr. Black's ledger and matching it to corresponding death certificates and case files, where available. With the help of medical students and a former Tribune archivist named Lou Gelman, Helen compiled a side-by-side record of suspected bribery cases, actual cause of death entries, inconsistencies in post-mortem handling. They found over 110 cases where death certificates appeared to have been issued under external pressure, often minimizing responsibility in industrial accidents or police-involved deaths. One entry in the ledger simply read, "Warehouse 16, 3 bodies, 0 answers, pressured to naturalize all 3. The corresponding certificates read, "Cardiac arrest, exhaustion-related pulmonary collapse, cause undetermined, assumed natural. No mention of burns, suffocation, or injuries from collapse, all later confirmed by independent inquiry." The hollow institution. What Helen realized, more than anything, was this. The problem wasn't Emery Black. The problem was that the system had allowed him to be its only line of defense. No mandatory audits of the coroner's office. No external oversight committee. No standardized forensic procedure for suspicious deaths. No requirement for secondary reviews. Dr. Black had filled the silence not with answers, but with his own brand of defiance. But when that silence became the status quo, the cost was truth. The cases reopened. In February 1924, 3 cases from Dr. Black's tenure were formally reopened under public pressure. 1. The Packers Lane incident. Original ruling: accidental asphyxiation due to boiler leak. New finding: carbon monoxide poisoning from improper equipment, with known prior complaints. Implication: factory owner had previously offered a donation to Black's office. 2. Dorina Splin, age 19. Original ruling: suicide. New finding: blunt force trauma inconsistent with fall, possible domestic violence case. Note in ledger: pressured to leave door closed, family name matters, I didn't reopen it. 3. Alonzo Kinney, railway port. Original ruling: natural causes. New finding: evidence of assault, likely involved in union organizing activity. Note in ledger: told to bury him with no light, so I gave them nothing. In each case, Black had not lied, but he had withheld deeper investigation, knowing that even the truth might be twisted. Public perception split. As more details emerged, public sentiment fractured. To some, Dr. Emery Black was a coward, a man who chose passive resistance over active justice. To others, he was a tragic figure, the only line of ethical resistance in a corrupt city too large, too loud, and too cruel to fight directly. The truth, like most, was somewhere in between. A death without ceremony. Dr. Black died in May of 1924 in a boarding house on the city's west side. The death certificate, ironically, was signed by a new acting coroner, Dr. Morton Clay, a man with a reputation for transparency. Black's cause of death was listed as myocardial infarction due to chronic hypertension. Helen requested a copy of the autopsy. There wasn't one. The note in the file. Months later, Helen visited the old coroner's office, now partially under audit. While reviewing archived files from Black's final year, she found something unusual. A sealed envelope marked in Black's distinct handwriting. For the one who wouldn't stop asking. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Truth cannot live on paper alone. It needs a voice. Mine has ended. Yours is still sharp. Use it well. It wasn't a confession. It was a handoff, a legacy in ink. Helen Maris would go on to become the chief medical examiner for Cook County by 1937. She introduced mandatory autopsies in all cases of unattended deaths, independent review panels for in-custody fatalities, a digital index of coroner's notes, still named the Black Index today. But she never forgot the man whose silence taught her how loud injustice could be. Final reflection. In the end, Dr. Emery Black left behind no family, no estate, no monument. Just a building with too many closed drawers. But for those who listened closely enough, his silence spoke volumes. Because sometimes, the absence of truth is more damning than any lie. A legacy on trial. By late 1924, Dr. Emery Black was dead, but the consequences of his choices were only beginning to unfold. The hidden ledger, now referred to as the Black Book by the press, had become a lightning rod for public outrage and scholarly interest alike. As Helen Maris, now a rising figure in forensic medicine, continued to sort through decades of coroner records, a new and unexpected controversy emerged. Some of the death certificates bearing Dr. Black's signature were not signed by him at all. The Autopen conundrum. The discovery began with a simple observation. A young typist named Ethel Goodwin, working in the newly reorganized records office, was tasked with scanning old death certificates for microfilm. She noticed that certain signatures bore irregularities not in the spelling, but in their consistency. The angle, ink density, and spacing were identical, even on documents signed years apart. When compared against known samples of Black's verified signature, forensic handwriting experts determined that at least 200 certificates had likely been signed using a mechanical autopen, a device designed to mimic handwriting, rarely used in public offices at the time, and certainly not sanctioned by Cook County. Black, it seemed, had begun delegating the signing of death itself. Delegated deaths. If the autopen theory was true, it suggested that Dr. Black or someone in his office had created a system for signing off on deaths without review. This presented a grim possibility. How many of Chicago's citizens were declared dead by a machine? And why was this done? The more Helen dug, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Most of the autopen signed certificates involved individuals who had died in city-run shelters or workhouses, lacked next of kin, been listed as John Doe or unidentified male, died in the custody of local police or federal immigration authorities. In effect, the autopen had been used to quietly disappear the voiceless. The pauper's lot. During a visit to the Cook County Poor Farm Cemetery, now just a grassy field with few markers, Helen met with Father Alphonse Keating, a local priest who had performed dozens of burial rites during Black's tenure. He revealed that often, no one from the coroner's office ever came to verify identities. Sometimes, bodies arrived with nothing more than a number pinned to their shirt. Most weren't mourned, he told her, just planted. Many of these burials matched autopen certificates. It became clear Dr. Black had automated silence. Not out of laziness or cruelty, perhaps, but from a belief that these people had no one to advocate for them. That to delay bureaucracy in the name of dignity was not a luxury the system allowed. But Helen rejected that logic. To erase someone with a signature they never saw as a second death, she wrote. The hollow signatures. In a final twist of irony, Emery Black's own death certificate signed by the newly appointed coroner was scrutinized years later. Its signature was unusually shaky. A handwriting expert compared it to Dr. Morton Clay's known samples and declared it likely forged. The irony was almost poetic. The man who once signed death away in silence was himself passed off with a name not his own. Echoes in the courtroom. In 1926, a civil suit was filed on behalf of the family of Alonzo Kinney, the railway porter whose suspicious death had originally been ruled natural causes by Black. With new evidence and public momentum, the case went to court. Helen Maris testified. So did Lou Gelman and several handwriting experts. The court ruled that the original cause of death had been grossly negligent. The coroner's office had failed in its duty of care. $1,200 in damages was awarded to Kinney's surviving brother, less for financial restitution than for official recognition of wrong. It was the first time in Cook County history that a coroner's ruling had been successfully overturned by legal action. More would follow. Institutional overhaul. By 1930, the Cook County Coroner's Office had undergone a massive overhaul. The Office of Medical Examiner was created, separating medical science from political appointments. Autopsies became mandatory in all custodial deaths and unattended fatalities. A public database, primitive but transparent, was established for reviewing death causes. Use of mechanical signature devices was outlawed. The reforms were slow, painful, contested. But they happened because of a silent man's records and a loud woman's refusal to let them be buried. The final letter. In 1951, decades after the scandal had faded into history books, Helen Maris received a small envelope in her Chicago apartment. It had no return address. Inside was a brittle, yellowed note in Emery Black's unmistakable hand. "You were right, but if I had spoken, they would have replaced me with someone who lied. I chose quiet, not complicity. I hope your voice makes a better tool." The postmark. Evanston, IL, the same city where Talmadge had died, and where Black had disappeared from public life. Some believed it was a hoax. Helen never said one way or another. She kept the note in her desk drawer until her death in 1967. Final reflection. History doesn't always remember its quietest criminals, nor its quietest heroes. Sometimes those roles aren't clearly divided. Dr. Emery Black blurred that line for over 3 decades, signing away the lives of thousands, many of whom were failed long before his pen ever touched paper. But in his silence, he preserved evidence. And in that evidence, others found a voice. Because in the end, truth doesn't shout. It lingers. A forgotten place. In the winter of 1894, St. Dimphna's Hospital for the Mentally Unwell sat like a fortress on the edge of Dartmoor, a shadowed structure that seemed to repel the light. Built in 1847 and named for the patron saint of mental illness, the asylum held over 300 patients, though its design had only ever intended to house 180. Located just outside the village of Ashbourne, Devonshire, it was shrouded in mist and mistrust. Locals rarely spoke of it, save in hushed tones or superstitious warnings. Some said you could hear screams at night when the wind shifted. Others said the worst weren't the mad patients but the staff. In that same winter, a series of handwritten letters, unsigned, smuggled, and addressed to no one in particular, began to appear in the mailboxes of university professors, local editors, and a few political figures across the south of England. They were written in beautiful cursive. They described events inside St. Dimphna that were harrowing, implausible, and specific. Most recipients dismissed them as the ravings of a delusional inmate. Until 6 weeks later, the asylum's head archivist vanished along with dozens of patient files and a manuscript that had been kept hidden in a locked storage cabinet for nearly a decade. The letters, it turned out, weren't delusions. They were evidence. The archivist, Charles Edwin Flax, age 42, had been the asylum's recordkeeper for over a decade. A quiet, obsessively organized man with a fondness for Latin phrases and fountain pens, he was largely invisible to staff and patients alike. Flax's job was simple: maintain the records, admissions, discharges, deaths, daily logs, treatment notes. His handwriting was neat, precise, and oddly beautiful. It was said that he wrote each patient's name as though it were being engraved. But Flax was also something else, a keeper of secrets. And according to those who worked with him, in the final months before he disappeared, he had become increasingly withdrawn, often locking himself in the storage vault for hours, refusing meals, muttering phrases in Latin like verba manent, ubihamen silent. Words remain where men are silent. The letters appear. The first of the anonymous letters arrived on December 2nd, 1894, at the offices of the Oxford Journal of Psychiatry. It was a 4-page missive written in ink so dark it almost shimmered blue. The handwriting was unusually refined, with looping ascenders and careful punctuation. The content was shocking. The letter claimed that St. Dymphna's staff falsified death records for at least 11 patients who were in fact transferred elsewhere under false names. That a number of high-strung female patients were subjected to unapproved treatments including isolation for weeks, with food delivered only once daily. That one patient, referred to only as Patient 43B, had authored a manuscript describing the day-to-day horrors of life inside the asylum, complete with names, dates, and treatment methods. That the manuscript had been sealed, not because of delusion but because it reflected too much truth. The letter ended with a chilling line. They locked her words away because they feared who would listen. I am listening. An academic ignored. Dr. Francis Holt, an Oxford professor who received one of the letters, did something most others did not. He kept it. Though he dismissed it publicly as melodramatic nonsense, in his private journal, Holt wrote, "There is a disturbing rhythm to this writing. Madness, yes, but controlled madness. Someone is crafting the voice carefully." He made inquiries to St. Dymphna regarding patient 43B. He was told there was no such patient. 3 days later, his office was broken into. Nothing was stolen except the letter. The asylum's history of silence. St. Dymphna's had a long history of uninvestigated rumors. In 1882, a fire destroyed the Western Ward. No official cause was ever determined. In 1886, a nurse accused a doctor of assault. Her claims were dismissed, and she was later committed herself. In 1890, a patient allegedly escaped and was found drowned weeks later. The incident was recorded simply as elopement failure. Through all of this, the only consistent voice had been the meticulous files of Charles Flax, which made his sudden disappearance in January 1895 all the more alarming. He did not resign. He did not leave a note. He simply vanished. The missing manuscript. After Flax disappeared, a search of the archive room revealed 3 patient files removed from the cabinets, a storage drawer pried open with force, a broken fountain pen still wet with ink lying on the floor. Most curiously, the metal lockbox used to store unstable writings, by patients normally locked and sealed, was empty. That box had contained a manuscript, an unnamed collection of writings by a long-term female patient from the 1880s, known to staff only as 43B. She had died, according to Flax's earlier records, in 1890. The manuscript, Flax had once claimed in a staff meeting, was not mad but methodical. Now it was gone. The handwriting connection. In February 1895, a local newspaper received another letter. This one wasn't addressed to any person or office. It was simply titled, "To Whom Truth Still Matters." Inside were 2 handwritten pages. The first was a continuation of the original letters describing a treatment referred to internally as quieting by repetition, in which patients were read the same phrase over and over for days until they stopped responding. The second page was a sample of handwriting. It was flawless, identical to the asylum's daily report logs, identical to Charles Flax's signature on official forms. Flax had been the author all along. Or perhaps the transcriber. The Whispering Room. Among the stories in the letters was one recurring detail, a room known only to staff as the Whispering Room. Not officially part of the hospital's blueprint, it was rumored to exist beneath the eastern wing, a stone-walled chamber where patients deemed beyond help were taken for final treatments. Descriptions varied, but several letters referred to the room using the same phrase, where words go to die. If real, this room had never been documented, photographed, or acknowledged. Helen Maris, yes, the same Helen from the Cook County coroner story decades later, by then an avid follower of historical asylum practices, would later write in a paper. The Whispering Room, if it existed, was not a place of therapy. It was a vault, not for the body but for language. A final letter. The last known letter arrived in April 1895 at the home of Lady Margaret Hensley, a philanthropist and donor to several London hospitals. It was shorter than the others. Inside a single page. I have not left. I am now in the ledger itself. Do not look for me in corridors or attics. Find me where she lived in the margins. And when you read her words, do not correct the spelling. That is where the scream begins. There were no more letters after that. The open questions. Investigators never located Charles Flax. His name did not appear on passenger lists, hospital admissions, or death registers. The identity of patient 43B was never confirmed, though asylum logs from the late 1880s reference a woman admitted under the name M.E.L., age 27, committed for linguistic disassociation and obsessive writing behavior. The manuscript was never recovered. But in 1961, during renovations of St. Dymphna's East Wing, a set of bones was discovered sealed behind a bricktop wall. Next to the remains, a rusted tin box containing 5 pages of cramped handwriting. Each page repeated the same sentence. This story is mine until you try to end it. What if madness isn't the absence of reason, but the rejection of someone else's version of truth? The MEL hypothesis. By 1896, St. Dymphna's Asylum had returned to normal on the surface. Charles Flax remained missing. No new letters had surfaced. The whispers about the mysterious patient 43B began to fade, absorbed into the asylum's long history of rumor and tragedy. But among a small group of academics and reformists, the question lingered. Who was MEL, the patient believed to be the original author of the missing manuscript? A search through local court records, hospital logs, and private charity archives finally unearthed a name. Margaret Eleanor Lowndes, age 27, committed on May 18, 1882, by her father, Reverend Thomas Lowndes, a prominent clergyman in the Devonshire district. Her listed condition: compulsive writing disorder, fixation on repetition, severe melancholia, unstable linguistic expression. But in the margins of the admittance sheet, scrawled in a different hand, were 3 words. Not violent, not mute. She had been institutionalized not for danger to others, but because she would not stop writing. The incrum. According to later interviews with surviving staff from the 1880s, Margaret was known throughout the asylum for her writing frenzies. She would fill page after page on scraps of linen, strips of paper, even bed sheets with looping, obsessive text. One nurse, in a long-forgotten letter to her sister, rediscovered in the 1940s, described her. She does not scream or claw like the others. She writes. She writes like the devil is dictating. In 1883, she was given her own cell, which staff came to nickname the Encroom. It was sparsely furnished, just a cot, a lamp, and a desk nailed to the floor. Every week, the orderlies would collect her writings. Most were burned, but a small percentage were kept for record-keeping purposes. That portion, according to later discoveries, matched the handwriting style in the anonymous letters mailed a decade later. The manuscript itself. Though the original full manuscript was never recovered, a partial reconstruction was attempted in the early 20th century based on fragments preserved in unrelated records, mostly scraps, misfiled among patient intake forms and staff schedules. From these fragments, researchers learned the manuscript was narrative in form, not a diary, but a story told through the voice of a patient narrator, with shifting tenses and fluid time. It described the rooms of the asylum as characters, the corridor as the whisperer, the stairwell as the coil, and the basement as the forgetting throat. Specific patients and staff were described not by name but by metaphors: the doorkeeper, the stone voice, the hungry coat. The tone was not hysterical but measured, elegant, and poetic, with a cadence that mirrored religious liturgy. One especially haunting passage, copied into an inspector's notebook, read, "They say we lose language here, but it is not language that dies, it is listening. The words are still written, you just stopped reading." Charles Flax in the listening game. Records show that Charles Flax began working at St. Dymphna in 1884, 2 years after Margaret's admittance. At that time, he was just a junior archivist, hired to help organize the increasingly chaotic patient records. Several staff letters noted that Flax was overly interested in the writings of certain patients, particularly the woman in the Encroom. It's believed that he began preserving Margaret's writings in secret, hiding them behind false covers or slipping them between benign files. It's unclear how much of the manuscript he copied or if he completed it at all, but his obsession grew. By 1890, the year of Margaret's recorded death, Flax was senior archivist and the only person with full access to both official and restricted records. He is believed to have compiled the full manuscript by hand, and possibly wrote the letters himself or edited them from Margaret's original prose. In his final months at the asylum, his own handwriting began to change, mirroring hers. One colleague even noted, "He's writing like the dead girl, same curves, same rhythm, it's as though she's using his hand." The coded pages. Among the pages recovered behind the sealed wall in 1961, see Section 1, several included intentional misspellings and grammar distortions, arranged in repeating patterns. Language scholars later concluded these were likely code markers, a form of cipher embedded into narrative structure. When one such page was subjected to early cryptographic analysis, it revealed one among them lives outside the patient wing. This hinted at an insider, possibly staff, complicit in the treatments or disappearances described in the letters. If true, it would suggest that Margaret was not just an observer, but a witness to something deliberately hidden. The Blackletter File. In 1929, long after the scandal had faded, a former orderly at St. Dymphna's John Harold Care published an anonymous memoir titled Behind the Walls, 30 Years Inside Madness. Though dramatized, one chapter described a secret file known as the Blackletter folder, kept in a locked drawer in the administrator's desk. It allegedly contained names of patients not listed in public records, medical orders with no physician signature, end-of-line treatment notes, entries with no outcome, no signature, and no follow-up. He claimed one of those names was M.E. Loans. This folder, Care wrote, was where the patients disappeared from paper. To date, the Blackletter folder has never been found. The chain of disappearances. Strangely, St. Dymphna saw an unusually high number of disappearances and unverified deaths between 1887 and 1894. 6 patients listed as discharged to family, but with no forwarding address. 2 nurses who resigned suddenly, with no written resignation or pension withdrawal. 1 groundskeeper who vanished during winter and was presumed lost in the moor fog. These disappearances were never linked at the time, but the anonymous letters mention them all with details not found in public logs. They leave the room with names, but come back as whispers. The Journal of Ink. In 2008, while cataloging the private collection of a deceased London book collector, researchers found a leather-bound journal with a title engraved in silver. The ink remains. The journal contained copied pages believed to be transcriptions of Margaret's original manuscript. A small note at the back read, "Copied from originals by C.E.F. Dartmoor, 1891, 1894. It was signed only with the initials M.L. If authentic, the journal is the most complete version of the text believed to have existed since the manuscript's disappearance. Excerpts include, "They do not break the body here. They bend the words, over and over until your voice forgets how to return to you. One day they will find these pages and ask if I was mad. But tell me what's more mad, that I kept writing or that no one else did." Final reflection. The fate of Margaret Eleanor Lulls remains officially closed. Deceased, 1890. The fate of Charles Edwin Flax is still unsolved. Missing, presumed dead. But the story of St. Dymphna's is more than an unsolved case. It's a reminder that institutions often silence not by force, but by forgetting. And sometimes, the most damning truths are written in perfect cursive, tucked in margins and left unread for a century. What if the only difference between madness and warning was whether anyone believed you in time? A hidden archive. In 1974, a maintenance team at what remained of St. Dymphna's Hospital, now partially decommissioned and being converted into low-cost housing, broke through a sealed wall in what used to be the North Records Annex. Behind the wall, they found 24 crates, untouched for nearly 80 years. Each crate was labeled only with a Roman numeral, I through XXIV. Inside, documents, patient forms, and hundreds of pages of handwritten notes. The majority had no official record numbers, no filing codes, and no attribution. But the handwriting, it was all the same. The same slanted cursive, the same ink color, the same rhythmic strokes of someone who wrote not for record-keeping, but for immortality. They were, without question, the long-rumored manuscripts of M.E. Lulls, preserved and hidden by Charles Edwin Flax, who had vanished 80 years earlier. The Dymphna Papers. The documents, later catalogued under the title The Dymphna Papers, were analyzed by forensic archivists, psychiatric historians, and handwriting analysts over a span of 6 years. The findings were startling. 18 distinct narratives were identified, all written in Margaret's hand, each describing life inside the asylum through a surreal but consistent internal logic. The tone was not incoherent rambling, but a layered, metaphoric structure that scholars compared to early Gothic literature and even modernist stream-of-consciousness prose. Certain passages directly referenced real staff members, actual treatment methods, and incidents later corroborated by official records. One passage matched the original anonymous letter verbatim. The conclusion. Margaret was not delusional, she was documenting, in the only language she was allowed to use. The room without a door. Among the recovered writings was a recurring setting described in increasingly detailed prose, a place referred to only as the room without a door. At first, it sounded like a metaphor, a literary construct, but one passage caught the attention of investigators. It lies beneath the spiral hallway where the tile floor gives way to wood. No windows, the sound is swallowed, the light falls upward. Later renovation blueprints of St. Dymphna revealed a sealed sub-basement space beneath the East Wing stairwell, exactly where Margaret described it. In 1976, under pressure from historical preservation societies, the floor was removed. Beneath was a bricked-in chamber, 10 feet by 12 feet, with no entrance. Inside, a rusted table, a single steel chair, the remains of a rope, and on the wall, written in faded ink, "We are not forgotten, you are." No body was found, only a single tooth, embedded in the wood beneath the chair. Carbon dating suggested it belonged to a woman, aged approximately 30, from the late 1800s. The ink-stained confession. One particular letter, written in the same elegant hand, stood apart. Dated March 18, 1894, 10 months before Flax disappeared, it read, "I was told to stop. They said the words made the others restless. That reading was contagious. That understanding was a kind of fever. So they took the pen, but not before I hid the rest. He said he would finish it for me, that the story mattered more than the silence." The he is assumed to be Charles Flax. If so, this confirms that Flax had not only preserved Margaret's writings, he had taken up her voice after her death, finishing the manuscript as an act of defiance. The truth beneath the treatment. Medical historians reviewing the Dymphna papers concluded that many of the treatments described long-term isolation, sensory deprivation, forced, verbal silencing, and repetitive phrase therapy did exist in 19th century British asylums. What Margaret had done was translate institutional cruelty into narrative poetry. Her work wasn't madness, it was camouflaged journalism. She had survived by writing, and when she couldn't anymore, her archivist kept writing for her. Together, they created what scholars now refer to as the only known dual-authored psychographic testimony of its era. The death of the asylum. St. Dymphna's closed its doors permanently in 1981. Its remaining patients were transferred. Its records, what few remained, were moved to the National Mental Health Archive in London. But the Dymphna papers were not shelved with the rest. They were instead donated to the University of Exeter's Rare Manuscripts Division and sealed for 2 decades under conditions of dignity and research integrity. In 2002, on the anniversary of Margaret's supposed death, select pages were made public. Among the passages released, "I was never mad. I was inconvenient." Echoes in modern medicine. The case of Margaret Lowndes and Charles Flax has since become required reading in psychiatric ethics courses across the UK. Her writings are cited as precursors to first-person trauma narratives, examples of narrative resistance under institutional oppression, evidence that psychiatric record-keeping, when unexamined, can become a weapon. But perhaps most hauntingly, her words remind the modern world that not all erasures are acts of fire. Some are bureaucratic, some are slow, some are done with a signature. The final note. In the back cover of one of the final folders from the archive, written in tiny handwriting, were the words, "The asylum did not silence her. It taught her to whisper so loudly that it took a century to hear." The writing was not Margaret's. It matched the style of Charles Flax. Final reflection. Margaret Eleanor Lowndes died in a locked cell with ink-stained hands. Charles Edwin Flax vanished without a trace, his name buried in institutional dust. But their voices, layered in metaphor and pain, endured. Not because they shouted, but because they refused to stop writing. And long after the corridors of St. Dymphna's fell silent, the pages still spoke. A road with too many eyes. New Jersey Turnpike, 1982. Between mile markers 106 and 112, a stretch of gray asphalt cut through industrial parks, swamps, and factories, all watched over by a line of drab toll booths blinking their red and green lights in quiet rotation. To most drivers, these booths were nothing more than mechanical interruptions, a necessary transaction on the way to somewhere else. But to a man named Gerald Jerry Knox, they were something much more. An opportunity. Knox had worked the overnight shift at Toll Plaza G17 for 11 years. By all accounts, he was reliable if not particularly memorable, divorced, quiet, lived alone in Edison, listened to big band jazz, read technical manuals in his spare time. But in the fall of 1982, a routine maintenance audit revealed that Knox's lane consistently reported higher traffic volume than any other booth by a wide margin. The extra funds were accounted for. The traffic logs were filled. But something didn't add up. The flag that shouldn't have been there. It started with a computer glitch. New Jersey's Department of Transportation had recently begun implementing an experimental digital toll tracking system, which issued test scans of license plates using primitive infrared imaging. In early October, a tech at the state office noticed an anomaly. During one night shift at Plaza G17, Knox's lane logged more vehicles than physically passed through the plaza. How could that be? Upon reviewing archived footage from security tapes, a rarity in the early 80s, analysts were stunned to discover. Between 2:00 a.m. and 4:00 a.m., Knox's booth processed 86 vehicles. But video showed only 59 vehicles passing through. Where had the extra 27 cars come from? And more importantly, who was collecting the cash? The slush ledger. Investigators initially suspected a mechanical error, but the cameras, despite their grainy quality, did not lie. That's when a forensic accountant was brought in to quietly examine Knox's toll reporting slips. What he found would trigger an inquiry that would rattle the state's infrastructure trust for years. Each toll collector had to manually log anomalies, unpaid tolls, misreads, dropped coins, license plates too dirty to scan. But Knox had created a second logbook, a personal one which he submitted as a backup in case of state system failures. The book was neat, precise, and it included entries that didn't exist in any state ledger. Entries for vehicles that had never existed. Dozens of them, all recorded with plausible license plate numbers and valid vehicle descriptions, but when cross-checked with DMV records, most had never been registered anywhere in the country. The conspiracy begins to take shape. When questioned, Knox gave a curious response. "You have to keep the numbers even, makes the system flow smoother." He smiled as he said it. When asked about the fabricated vehicle entries, he shrugged. Some cars come through that don't belong on paper, doesn't mean they're not real. At first, the investigators assumed he was covering up a coin-skimming operation, a classic toll booth scam where attendants underreport traffic and pocket the difference. But the numbers weren't underreported, they were inflated. The state wasn't losing money. If anything, it was taking in extra revenue. So where was the conspiracy? And who else was involved? The man in the Lincoln. In late October, an off-duty state trooper, Officer Raymond Hadley, passed through Plaza G17 during a storm. The plaza was quiet. Knox was on duty. Hadley was waved through without charge, an informal courtesy common at the time. But 30 minutes later, Hadley called in a report. He had passed the plaza again, doubling back after a missed turn, and saw the same black Lincoln Continental enter the toll lane twice in under 5 minutes. He noted the plate, NJ9Q1145. When state records were checked, the vehicle didn't exist. When the security footage was pulled, the car was there. Same make, same plate, same timestamp. But the driver's face was never visible. Just a gloved hand. The phantom lanes. Now curious beyond suspicion, the Department of Transportation initiated a full review of Knox's toll booth logs going back 6 months. The audit team found repeated entries of the same license plates across multiple nights. Some vehicles logged as entering and exiting the same plaza without traveling any distance. Toll receipts with faintly altered timestamps, sometimes off by seconds clearly edited. But the most disturbing detail: several of the plates matched vehicles registered to missing persons. The disappearances. Over the previous year, 4 individuals had vanished within a 30-mile radius of Plaza G17. Douglas Emery, a delivery driver en route to Newark. Francis Little, a schoolteacher commuting late from a conference. Tommy Ramirez, a 17-year-old mechanic last seen driving his father's pickup. Lenora Briggs, a nurse who left her shift after midnight and never arrived home. In each case, the last confirmed location was within proximity of the turnpike, but investigators had assumed the disappearances were unrelated. Now, audit logs showed that vehicles matching their descriptions had been logged in Knox's booth after the times they were reported missing. Their families were never notified. No police report had ever connected the toll logs to the case. No one thought to check. The Book of False Journeys. When Knox was finally arrested for fraud and obstruction of investigation, his home was searched. Among dozens of highway maps, ledger pads, and old toll slips, officers found a small black notebook in a kitchen drawer, labeled only Echoes. Inside, 37 names, license plate numbers, dates, a final column labeled Returned. Only 6 names had a mark in the returned column. All others were blank. This was no theft scheme. This was a record of movement or perhaps entrapment of people who had passed through his booth and never fully left it. Knox's statement. During a brief psychological evaluation, Knox offered this chilling remark. Some tolls are paid with money, some with time. But a few pay with memory. They go through and forget they ever left. When asked to explain further, he simply repeated, "You have to keep the numbers even." He was declared mentally unfit for trial and committed to a secure facility. He died in 1994, having never spoken of the events again. The system that didn't blink. Despite public pressure, no criminal charges were filed against the New Jersey Department of Transportation. Their response: no financial losses occurred. No evidence of broader conspiracy was found. They ignored the dead license plates, the matching names of missing persons, the haunting repetition of numbers. Instead, the state quietly decommissioned Plaza G17 in 1985. It was bulldozed and replaced with a newer digital toll collection system. No attendance, no logs, no questions. Final reflection. What happened at G17 was never formally solved. But somewhere in the vast archives of the dot, a single microfilm reel still exists. It shows 2:38 a.m. October 19, 1982. A black Lincoln enters lane 3. It pays a toll. The gate rises. It drives forward. But the exit camera never sees it leave. The booth counted it. The system accepted it. And the road swallowed it whole. The G17 microfilm. After the demolition of Toll Plaza G17 in 1985, its records were presumed destroyed. But in 1996, during a major archival digitization project by the New Jersey State Records Office, a forgotten box labeled Historical Toll Imaging Plaza was discovered in a warehouse near Camden. Inside were 3 reels of microfilm, unlabeled except for the range, July to November 1982. A team of state interns was tasked with scanning and cataloging the footage. The images were grainy, the timestamps faded but intact. And then came a clip marked October 23, 1982, 3:14 a.m. The footage showed something strange. A red Chevrolet Nova pulled up to lane 4. The booth light was red. There was no toll collector visible inside the glass. But after 18 seconds, the gate lifted by itself. The Nova moved forward slowly and vanished into fog. According to the audit logs from that night, lane 4 was officially closed. The car should never have been allowed through. The license plate, K53 and W9. That number matched a missing persons vehicle report filed by the family of Travis Dempsey, a 22-year-old warehouse worker last seen on October 22. The toll booth counted the car, the logs showed it, but no one was manning the lane. The toll collector's journal. Months before Gerald Knox's arrest, he had taken several sick days unusual for him. During those days, a replacement collector named Victor Mancuso was assigned to the graveyard shift. After the Knox investigation broke, Mancuso came forward to police with a disturbing statement. The booth was wrong, the air was wrong. It was like the lights blinked out of time. Mancuso kept a personal journal during his time working the plaza. On the night of September 14, 1982, he wrote, "Counted 46 vehicles, log only showed 38. One car pulled in no driver, just empty, still had its lights on." He assumed it was a malfunction. But then he added, "I asked the supervisor, he told me, just write it down and let it go. G17's been weird since '79. The 1979 incident. Digging deeper into G17's history revealed a previous disturbance never formally linked to Knox. In February 1979, 3 toll collectors quit within the same week. One left a resignation note. "I won't be the gatekeeper anymore. They don't all come from here." Another collector, Avery Lynn, vanished just days after. His final toll log was found in the back of a filing cabinet. It was labeled. They passed without payment. All vehicle entries had been crossed out, rewritten, and crossed out again. At the bottom, "The gate doesn't count truth, it counts acceptance." Lynn was never found. The algorithm that knew too much. Fast forward to 2007. As part of an experimental traffic optimization program, the New Jersey Turnpike Authority developed an AI-assisted tracking tool to analyze historical traffic patterns and anomalies. A data scientist named Elena Bower was running test models using legacy toll booth data from 1980-1985. She noticed a strange mathematical consistency in the G17 logs. Every 17 nights, the number of vehicles logged in lane 3 increased by exactly 27, even if traffic reports showed no change. These anomalies never tripped fraud flags. The timestamps matched low visibility conditions: fog, rain, snow. Bower dubbed it the Phantom 27 pattern. When she cross-referenced the dates with missing persons reports within a 50-mile radius, 9 matched all people last seen traveling near the turnpike, all on nights that fit the pattern. Bower submitted her findings to the Turnpike Authority. She was dismissed 3 weeks later for inappropriate use of historical data bandwidth. She later claimed, "The pattern wasn't a glitch, it was a design. Someone, maybe Knox, had embedded a rhythm into the data. The gate didn't just open for cars, it opened on schedule." The third booth. Rumors had long circulated among collectors that G17 had a third toll booth, one not listed on state maps or shift rosters. Some claimed it was used only during emergencies. Others said it had been sealed since the 1960s. But in an aerial photograph from 1983, later unearthed in a civil engineer's portfolio, a small booth-shaped structure is visible just beyond the main lanes, behind a chain-link gate. No roads led to it. No cars ever approached it. When asked, former construction workers said they remembered laying concrete over something odd near the plaza in 1986. They were told it was an outdated utility vault. That third booth no longer exists. Its foundations are beneath a featureless section of median strip, with no manhole, no hatch, no entry. The toll collection manual, redacted pages. In 1989, a FOIA request uncovered an internal toll collection training manual used by the New Jersey DOT between 1977 and 1984. Most of it was boilerplate how to handle transactions, count coins, report machine faults. But page 74 was missing. Its table of contents listed page 74 as Protocol for Unlogged Passages. No one would explain what the procedure entailed. When a former DOT supervisor, Franklin Royce, was asked about the missing page during a 1999 interview, he laughed nervously and said, "Oh, that page, you only read that if you worked G17, and only at night." Gerald Knox's final envelope. After Knox's death in 1994, his effects were sent to next of kin and estranged sister in Florida. She refused the items. Among them was a sealed envelope marked, "If they ever find the journal." Inside, a folded highway map of the turnpike, with a section circled in red ink. A single line of text. "You can't stop the flow, you can only keep the ledger balanced." And a blank toll slip, except for one line handwritten across the bottom. "Not all who drive come from where you think." Final reflection. What happened at Toll Plaza G17 wasn't just a case of fraud. It was a system manipulated to let something through something never meant to be seen. Gerald Knox may have been a criminal, or a gatekeeper, or perhaps just another passenger. One who stayed too long at the booth, listening to cars pass in the dark, until he forgot which ones were real. And as the fog rolled in, the red lights blinked slowly. And the gate counted ghosts. The exit that never was. Route logs from the New Jersey Turnpike Authority list hundreds of exits, detours, and service routes across the decades. But in one version of the 1981 Driver's Operations Manual, there's a strange anomaly. Page 312 lists. Exit 9B, G17 South Loop access, no public entry. There is no such exit on any known map. Satellite data shows only an overgrown lot where the alleged loop should be, flanked by disused fencing, and a dirt path that ends abruptly near mile marker 109.4. And yet, handwritten next to that entry in a recovered copy of the manual were the words, "They never exit, they just stop being counted." Who wrote it unclear. The manual was recovered from a DOT warehouse slated for demolition in 1991. The warehouse burned down 6 days later under unknown circumstances. Fire inspectors noted the blaze appeared to originate inside a locked filing cabinet. No fire accelerants were found. A whisper in the static. In 2004, a retired radio technician named Samuel "Sammy" Trent came forward with a bizarre story. Trent had worked with the DOT's internal communications in the early 80s. During his time maintaining shortwave channels used between toll plazas, he noticed that G17's booth radios frequently picked up unknown static patterns, often when no cars were passing through. It sounded like breathing at first, then it became speech, but not words I understood, like numbers being counted in reverse. Trent recorded one such clip, stored on a Maxell cassette labeled Lane 3 Oct 17. A spectral analysis done in 2010 revealed a pattern of pulses spaced exactly 11.7 seconds apart, fluctuating in pitch between recordings consistent with a heartbeat pattern. But the audio also included faint voice fragments, one of which analysts agreed sounded like, "You are not registered," "missing toll funds," or something else. In 1983, following Knox's arrest, an investigation into toll booth anomalies extended statewide. A report titled Unresolved Toll Patterns and Revenue Irregularities, 1978-1983, found $728,000 in unexplained overage from 8 booths, with no physical evidence of cash shortages or falsification. Of that, $203,000 came from G17 alone. Oddly, none of these extra funds were flagged because they balanced the books. One forensic accountant, Iris Devane, later testified, "Knox didn't steal, he filled gaps. Like he knew where the system was short and then made it whole." The implication wasn't just that he fabricated traffic, but that the system needed his numbers to remain functional. Almost like Knox had become part of the logic loop itself. A patch to broken road. The travelers who came again. A final and chilling layer to the story came from Officer Raymond Hadley, the state trooper who'd originally flagged the repeating Lincoln Continental. In 1998, Hadley, long retired, contacted a paranormal researcher named Deborah Kell with a disturbing update. "I saw it again, same make, same plate. NJ9Q1145. It passed me on the Garden State Parkway. No one inside, just the radio playing Count Basie." Count Basie, Knox's favorite. Kell obtained traffic camera footage. The license plate was visible, matching the plate from 1982, but the registration was marked as retired/scrapped in 1984. And the vehicle make? A 1972 Lincoln. Kell's team compiled 6 similar sightings of repeating vehicles, connected to G17 logs all long after the booth was gone. Some even showed up in multiple states. Legacy of the G17 phenomenon. Today, no physical trace of G17 remains. But its myth endures in urban legends, Reddit threads, and conspiracy blogs under names like The Ghost Gate, Booth Zero, The Toll You Forget You Paid, G17 Syndrome. A few commonalities across these stories. A sense of time being lost while driving past exit 109. Navigation systems failing temporarily in that area. Unusual dreams after night driving in that stretch, often about being counted or passing through an unmanned gate. One man even claimed to have found a toll receipt in his glove box, dated 1982, though his car had never been manufactured until 1996. Closure that never came. Gerald Knox died without a confession. But he left behind something else. In a safety deposit box, opened in 2005 by court order, was a single reel of 8mm film. On it, a montage of night traffic stitched together from inside the G17 booth. Midway through, the film begins to degrade, lines streaking the image, but not before a final frame. A driver pausing before the gate. Knox's reflection in the glass. And a handwritten phrase across the screen. "You pass through me. I do not pass through you." Final reflection. Some crimes leave bodies, others leave debts. This one left a ledger with no origin, a system desperate for balance, and a man who became a part of that balance until he vanished like so many who passed through his lane. Was Knox a fraud, a fantasist, a vigilante accountant, or simply the last person willing to count the uncountable? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. The booth was never just a checkpoint. It was a threshold. And on certain nights, it didn't just collect coins. It collected presents. Tick-tock in the village of Newborough. Newborough, a quiet Welsh village nestled just south of Snowdonia, was a place that aged well. Stone cottages, rolling hills, wind-brushed pines, the sort of town where the post office doubled as a bakery and everyone still knew when the milk was delivered. And at the heart of it stood a shop that never changed. Penderyn Horology, timepieces repaired and restored since 1891. It was run by a man named Owen Rees, known locally as the clockmaker. He was meticulous, soft-spoken, and always wore the same dark gray waistcoat, even in summer. His shop smelled of old wood, engine oil, and faint lavender. Clocks filled every inch of space, grandfathers, mantles, cuckoos, marine chronometers, all ticking in oddly satisfying disharmony. But in the autumn of 1988, something changed. Time in Newborough began to feel different. A minute too long. It began with complaints from commuters. The local bus route was suddenly arriving ahead of schedule, despite leaving on time. The school bell rang too early. And Mrs. Glenda Perry, who ran the corner newsagent, swore her watch was eating seconds. No one panicked. Clocks fail, batteries fade. Until someone noticed the church tower bell chimed 1 minute before the hour, every time. The bell mechanism had been serviced just months earlier by Rees himself. A visitor from Cardiff. On November 3rd, Detective Alastair Wynne arrived in Newborough from Cardiff under unusual circumstances. He was investigating a series of odd burglaries involving no signs of forced entry. The only common thread: each victim owned a restored antique clock, most of which had been serviced by Penderyn Horology. 3 homes had been targeted. Nothing was stolen except one item from each: a small brass gear from the internal mechanism of each clock. The parts were precise and delicate, useless on their own, except to someone who knew how to manipulate clockwork. The 4th chime. On November 9th, Wynne arrived at Rees's shop under the pretense of needing his wristwatch cleaned. He was welcomed warmly. Rees offered him tea. Wynne described the shop as hypnotic, an endless ticking that created a sense of suspended motion. The clocks were all working, yet none showed the same time. When asked why, Rees replied, "Every home keeps its own time. I only guide it back." It was then that Wynne noticed something peculiar. A grandfather clock in the back room was moving backward. The hands were ticking in reverse, slowly, 1 second at a time. The hollow clock. Wynne obtained a warrant to examine Rees's property more closely after receiving a tip from a retired locksmith who'd once helped Rees restore a 19th-century long-case clock. The locksmith said the base had a hidden compartment unusual, but not unheard of in antique pieces. Rees had dismissed it as a curiosity, nothing more. When Wynne and local constables returned days later, they found the clock in question gone. Rees claimed it had been sold, but the buyer's name, John Matheson, did not exist in any village records. Disappearances begin. Within the next 6 weeks, 2 residents vanished. Laurie F. Fionn, age 68, a local history teacher and frequent customer at Penderyn Horology. Idris Llewellyn, age 31, a part-time courier who once delivered parcels for Rees. Both had recently had clocks restored by the shop. In each of their homes, police found something odd: identical brass keys tucked into the backs of their clocks. Keys that did not fit any part of the mechanisms. Keys etched with the number 1904. No year had relevance to their lives, but it was the year of a fire that partially destroyed Penderyn Horology's workshop, an event that had never been widely publicized. A note in the dust. Wynne and his team eventually obtained access to Rees's basement after pressure from the village council. The basement, cluttered with broken timepieces and shelving, held a large wooden crate wrapped in tarpaulin. Inside was a partially assembled automaton, a humanoid figure, 8 feet tall, made entirely of brass gears, pressure springs, and ceramic joints. The inner panel of its chest was engraved. The Collector of Lost Time, begun 1904, incomplete. Dust covered most of the crate, but someone had written a message into it with a finger. Every second misplaced must be gathered again. Final reflection. The case remained unofficial. Reese was never charged. There was no hard evidence, only gear fragments, reversed tickings, and clocks that never seemed to stay synced. But Wynne never forgot. He retired in 1993. His final report, filed unofficially, simply read: "Some people steal gold, some steal secrets. But Owen Reese, he stole time, 1 second at a time, and maybe people with it." To this day, Penderyn horology remains open. Its clocks still tick out of sync. And at midnight, every year on November 9th, one clock in the back of the shop chimes 13 times. The villagers say it's just tradition. But no one goes in after dark. A missing blueprint. 2 weeks after the discovery of the automaton labeled the Collector of Lost Time, Detective Alastair Wynne contacted the Royal Institute of Horology in London, seeking expert analysis. They identified the mechanism's design as impossible by early 20th century standards. The balanced spring-tension ratios, the nested escapements, some elements predated even Breguet's most advanced complications. Yet every component was hand-fashioned, numbered, and uniquely cast. What baffled them most was that the pieces were not made for display or novelty, as most automatons were. They were meant to operate independently, possibly without a wind-up key. One expert, Dr. Renata Cole, observed, "This isn't a toy. It's a machine for performing a sequence. A performance only it understands. But who wrote that sequence? And why did the mechanism require precisely 1904 moving parts?" The Penderyn Ledger. While investigating an unrelated complaint of back taxes, a municipal clerk stumbled upon a small ledger filed under Historical Business Tax Reliefs, Artisan Exception, Category 3B. The book listed Penderyn Horology under its original founder, J. M. Reese, Owen Reese's father. The ledger showed that, starting in 1904, the shop declared annual losses in materials without corresponding entries for sales. It became clear the workshop had been constructing something in secret for over 80 years, expending thousands in rare alloys, brass, silver filaments, and none of it was ever sold. That something was now resting, unfinished, in the basement crate. The names and the gears. When forensic analysts dismantled the automaton's lower arm, they discovered names etched into the gears, barely visible under oxidation. Laurie F. Fionn, Idris Llewellyn, Gareth Winford, Mayor Elise Jones. The last two had been listed as missing persons in 1931 and 1952, respectively. Both were villagers. Both had visited the shop in the years before their disappearances. Some of the gears even contained fingerprint impressions, perfectly preserved. Lab reports confirmed they were human, but untraceable to anyone currently living or listed in the national database. More than 24 names were eventually discovered, all matching past or present Newborough residents, all now presumed dead or disappeared. The new clock in town. In early 1989, a new clock was erected at the edge of Newborough's village square. It was modest, a cast-iron column with a circular face and gold inlay. The plaque read, "To mark the passage of all things, dedicated to time." No one remembered commissioning it. No receipts, no local government record. Just a signature at the base of the plaque. OR. The clock functioned perfectly, always precise. until one day in spring 1990, when it suddenly ran backward for 13 minutes, then resumed normal function. On that same morning, a local shepherd, Ewan Morris, reported finding a small brass key in the pasture identical to those found in the homes of the missing. Etched on its stem, time returns what it is owed. The locksmith's confession. Near the end of his life, the now-blind locksmith who had once worked with Owen Rees gave a taped interview to a BBC historical program on British craftsmanship. Unprompted, he said, "Rees didn't just fix clocks, he gathered seconds. Took them from people like stones in a stream. He said if he could collect enough of them, he could finish his father's work." When asked what that work was, the old man whispered, "To undo the hour that broke the family." He never explained what the hour was. But further genealogical research into the Rees family revealed that in 1904, Emrys Rees lost his wife and infant son in a fire that began when a clock exploded during restoration. Some believe that event led to a lifelong obsession with reclaiming lost time down to the second. The hour that disappeared. In summer 1991, a rare atmospheric event known as a diurnal phase inversion caused the sky over Newborough to darken prematurely. Locals described it as a false dusk. Shadows lengthened strangely, farm animals grew agitated, and at exactly 2:13 p.m., every clock in Penderyn horology stopped for exactly 1 hour, then resumed in perfect sync. No batteries failed, no mechanical faults were found. Owen Rees was not seen for the entire day. But later that night, a single cuckoo clock in the front display window began to chime once every 27 minutes for the next 24 hours. The significance of the number was unclear. But one theory emerged, that 27 minutes was the exact time lost by the 4 people whose names were etched in the automaton. The machine that waited. After the shop was shuttered by order of the council in 1992, citing building instability, Rees vanished. He left behind no forwarding address, no will, no known relatives. The automaton remained locked away in municipal storage until 2001, when it was quietly acquired by a private collector in Basel under mysterious circumstances. Its current location is unknown, but rumors persist on horology forums that the automaton still functions, even in pieces, that if you stand close, you can hear the gears whisper your own name. Final reflection. Owen Rees built clocks, but what he truly crafted was a mechanism for remembrance. A device not to track time but to rewind it, store it, and possibly exchange it for what no one knows. Was it grief that drove him? Madness? Or did he discover something real in the mathematics of seconds and spring coils? Maybe he believed time was like a debt, and he was merely settling the account. But the clocks in Newborough have never quite worked the same since. And sometimes, in the dead of night, the old church bell still chimes at 13 minutes past the hour, even when the hands point to 12. The return of the watchmaker. In April 2004, 12 years after his disappearance, Owen Rees was spotted. A tourist couple from Carmarthen claimed they saw an elderly man winding a pocket watch under the overgrown archway of the abandoned Penderyn horology shop. The woman took a photo, blurred but distinct. The posture, the gray waistcoat, the watch chain. It matched a 1978 local newspaper photo of Rees almost exactly. When authorities arrived 2 days later, the shop's interior remained sealed. Yet inside, a new clock had appeared in the window, one no one had ever seen before. It bore no numerals, only a single black hand rotating counterclockwise. And a phrase etched across the face in brass filigree. "This hour was never yours." The photo and the clock reignited interest in the case and drew new scrutiny from unexpected places. The Clockwork Registry. In 2007, A grad student named Myra Denholm was digitizing property logs from Gwinnett County's historic registry when she discovered an unusual subfolder. Time-kept devices, Judicial Archive section. Inside were 47 detailed forms listing every major timekeeping device Owen Reese had registered as repaired between 1962 and 1989. Of those, 19 clocks had been declared inoperable by their owners within a year. 7 homes associated with those clocks experienced non-fatal house fires. 3 owners went missing. One, a librarian named Griffin Wells, was found dead in his study, surrounded by 8 ticking clocks, each set to a different time, each frozen at exactly 13 past the hour. In each case, Reese's signature appeared, neatly written, next to the entry. Corrected for temporal compliance. The 13th hour theory. Several fringe horology researchers, inspired by the Reese mystery, posited a radical hypothesis. Time is not bound by 24 hours, but 25. The idea suggests there exists a ghost hour, a 13th hour lost in the calibration of modern timekeeping systems, a sliver of chronology shaved off by calendar corrections and mechanical convenience. Reese, they argue, sought to reclaim this missing hour, believing it was where regrets lingered, where lost things might be retrieved. He wasn't just winding time forward or backward. He was winding it aside, wrote one theorist in a now-deleted blog post. Evidence weak, but compelling enough that the British Museum of Horology quietly obtained several of Reese's lesser-known works and placed them in long-term restricted storage. A spokesperson declined to comment, citing security concerns. The 13th chime. On November 9, 2009, exactly 21 years after the original incidents, the abandoned Penderyn horology shop chimed 13 times at midnight. There was no power, no staff, no known source. Locals gathered outside, some holding their breath. One man, a descendant of Idris Llewellyn, one of the vanished, approached the front steps and claimed he heard his uncle's voice, faintly, inside the shop. "I just needed more time." No one else heard it. But after that night, the front window of the shop began showing signs of fogging from the inside, though no one had entered for years. Footprints appeared in the dust, brass filings on the sill, and a single key was mailed anonymously to the village council, wrapped in velvet. For the next keeper, what remains? As of 2025, Penderyn horology remains sealed under historic protection laws. But the town of Newborough still notes strange phenomena. Clocks stopping at 1:13 a.m. precisely once a year. GPS anomaly for drivers who pass through the village at midnight. Dreams reported by tourists that describe ticking noises even in silence, and glimpses of a tall brass figure watching through windows. The automaton, the collector of lost time, has not been seen in public since 2001. But fragments of it have been traced to private collections: an arm in Vienna, a torso in Tokyo. Curators report that even in pieces, the parts continue to move, if only slightly. Reese's final notebook. In 2020, a cracked leather notebook surfaced at a London estate sale, its provenance unknown. On the inner cover, written in precise cursive, "Property of O. Reese. For calibration only." The pages were filled with equations, gear sketches, and phrases repeated again and again. Time is dead. Every moment is borrowed. 13 is the key. And on the final page, there is no such thing as a lost hour. Only misplaced permission. Final reflection. Owen Reese may have started as a man repairing clocks, but he ended as something else. A custodian of time's mistakes. Whether what he built was madness, method, or miracle, he treated seconds like currency, and some believe he tried to buy back something impossible. A lost loved one, A moment never lived, a day that should have gone differently. The 13th hour was never part of our timekeeping. But perhaps it exists in the cracks between minutes, between regrets, between gears that never quite stop turning. And if you listen, truly listen, when all the clocks in your house are silent, you might still hear a ticking,